So if something goes wrong, who's responsible? Is it the pilot, the person who found the target originally, the commander? It's already in that situation, it's difficult to allocate the responsibility. And if you introduce AI, it will be even more difficult.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Kevin Frazier, assistant professor at St. Thomas University College of Law and a Tarbell Fellow at Lawfare, with my colleague, Alan Rosenstein, a senior editor at Lawfare, and our guests, Ashley Deeks, professor at the University of Virginia School of Law, and Dr. Mark Klamberg, professor at Stockholm University, visiting professor at American University, and a fellow with the Atlantic Council.
I do think that the basic rules, things like distinction, proportionality, and precautions get us a long way in making sure that lethal autonomous weapon systems are not abused. But there are interpretive complications, just as there are when you're thinking about how to apply the laws of armed conflict to cyber operations.
Today, we're talking about the weaponization of AI and domestic and international efforts to regulate its use.
Way before ChatGPT, militaries were using lethal autonomous weapon systems. Mark, how has the use of such systems evolved over time, and in particular in the aftermath of ChatGPT? And can you provide us with some examples of such systems?
Well, much of the discussion has been on weapons platforms, but I think there's one area which has to some extent been ignored, and it's command and control systems. What we can see now, I mean, it has been going on for years, but what we can see now is that the command and control systems to a larger extent are relying on various kinds of automated systems in order to make targeting more expeditious. And there's both benefits and risks with that, as I see it. And two recent examples that I've been observing is one from Ukraine, where they've the GIS-ARTA command and control system, which they've been using to acquire targets, process it very fast, and deliver artillery firing on those targets. And another example is in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, where there's media reporting that Israel has also relied on a similar command and control system to acquire targets faster. So that's something interesting.
So, Mark, I make all of my students listen to this podcast throughout the year. If you were going to break that command and control down into perhaps simpler terms, what would that be for kind of the average listener?
Well, I'll give you the example from Ukraine. So you have members of the Ukrainian armed forces who are spotting potential targets, and they report that into a system. It's done through an app on their phones, as I understand it. And then this is distributed to artillery batteries, and the one that is closest will fire on the target. So instead of decisions and this information going through the ordinary chain of command, which normally might take an hour or something to go up the chain of the command for somebody to take a decision and then go back down again, it's more like a Uber or a Lyft, where you keep the decision making on a horizontal level very flat without going to the top brass, which makes it faster. So instead of 1 hour, you could get the artillery piece to fire within 1 minute after the target has been sighted.
So if I could just hop in on this, maybe at a macro level, this all seems both interesting and right, but it's also what we're seeing is states really kind of innovating on the fly, which is a little bit different from, I think, how our military has been going about thinking about developing AI systems, which has been, I think, very careful, a lot of testing, lots of adherence to kind of the ethical principles that the Pentagon has set out for itself. And here we're basically seeing these systems being tested in combat rather than before combat. I think the US and China and others are probably watching these developments quite closely to see what works, what doesn't work, where are sort of legal challenges that might arise. But the things that Mark described, I think, are interesting in for not just for the actors using them, but also for other states that are interested in moving in an autonomous direction.
So Ashley, let me actually follow up with you on that and ask you to talk about the kinds of risks we're concerned about. So oversimplifying, AI risks are often divided into sort of existential risks and I guess you could say non-existential risks, though those are still quite serious. And, one can easily imagine some non-existential risks of military AI, right? They can kill people, that sort of thing. But there are also a lot of concerns of what we might call the Skynet scenario, that we link up our AI system to weapons in such a way that could cause sort of civilizational level risks. And so I'm curious, and Mark, you should jump in also after Ashley, whether what you've seen in the last several years and what you expect to see in the next several years validates those concerns, or when we talk about the risks of national security AI, we're really talking about sub-existential, though again, still very important risks.
So I'll confess that I have focused more on the sub-existential risks, partly because they just seem nearer at hand, that it's hard for someone like me who's an academic and not a computer scientist, not a kind of future of life type thinker to focus on the kind of general AI spinning out into an existential risk scenario. I'm glad that other people are thinking about that, and maybe we'll talk in a bit about things like bioweapons, which could kind of get us there maybe in the nearer term. I mean, I think one thing that people, even maybe Congress, are thinking about is the interaction of systems potentially leading us to a dark place faster than we envision. That is, even if let's say the U.S. develops an advanced but responsible system, what I think we don't know yet is how one AI system is going to interact with another. People have thought about this in the cyber setting with some cyber autonomy, and there are different views, I think, about the risk of escalation. But I think people like Paul Shar do think that there's a kind of real risk that one offensive cyber system confronts a defensive cyber system from an adversary, and we kind of get off to the races, almost like a flash crash on the stock market. So that seems to me to be a place where Skynet may be coming for us, but I think that surely actors inside our military and intelligence communities are thinking hard about that.
So with these evolving systems and perhaps unexpected interactivity and perhaps increased capabilities that we're not anticipating, Mark, you've talked and discussed quite a bit the idea that it's going to become harder to assign responsibility for the use of these autonomous weapons. Can you give us an overview of how that might become even more complicated as we continue to see AI advance?
Well, I can give you an example. I spoke with a colleague who was part of the NATO intervention in Libya. I think it was 2011. And he described me how they acquired targets. And he explained how, in order to fire on one target during this operation, there was hundreds of persons involved in one decision. And so if something goes wrong, who's responsible? Is it the pilot, the person who found the target originally, the commander? It's already in that situation, it's difficult to allocate the responsibility. And if you introduce AI, it will be even more difficult. As I see it, Alan mentioned before this fear of the Skynet scenario. So I'm not that worried about that now. For now, I'm thinking more of what is happening now and these difficulties with assigning responsibility. And my personal view how to approach that is the person who decides to put this system on the battlefield. That's the person who primarily should be responsible. That's kind of my suggestion.
One proposal that I guess it's not even a proposal, but it's sort of a commitment that a company has made that seems like could be worth thinking about in this space is Volvo's commitment to basically take responsibility for accidents that happen as a result of their self-driving vehicles. And I believe that Google also, for its self-driving vehicles, would make a similar commitment. So, the companies, the large language model companies we're talking about, may not be excited to throw themselves in front of the train like that. But when you're talking about state uses, I kind of appreciate the clarity of of a single actor basically saying, we recognize that these are risky systems and we are going to take responsibility for X kinds of results that come from them. I think there's a lot of agreement that in international law, the idea of state responsibility will still attach. Apart from thinking about which particular individual would be responsible, we would basically be able to attribute responsibility to a state that was deploying a system that kind of went haywire or engaged in unlawful activity. But notice there too, the kind of interaction between state systems could actually complicate that. So even if the US said, yes, as a matter of state responsibility, we would be responsible for a particular act by our system. If the harm that resulted was because the US system was engaging in a complicated way with a Chinese system, I don't know that state responsibility becomes as clear anymore.
So Ashley, you actually brought up the question I wanted to ask, which was about companies themselves taking responsibility. And I actually wanted to sort of dig a little deeper into that. Do you know of any AI labs that create sort of military AI systems that have considered or have indeed stated that they will take responsibility in a way that Volvo has? I mean, it seems unlikely that, a Palantir would do that, but I don't know, maybe they have. And whether they have or not, should they? On the one hand, like you said, Ashley, it'd be nice to have a single point of responsibility. On the other hand, you don't necessarily want to dilute the idea of state responsibility. And then you get questions about, well, what if the same company is on both sides of the battlefield? So I am curious to sort of dig deeper on this idea of having the companies themselves take at least some measure of responsibility for what happens on the battlefield.
So I'm not aware that any of those tech companies has done what Volvo has done with regard to its sort of AI and weapon systems. And I mean, I think it's easy to be skeptical that a company would do that, given how many, potential uses one could put to particular systems. I suppose for defense contractors, it may be that they're producing particular militarized systems where it is pretty clear that they'll only be used for sort of one DoD purpose. I mean, in general, I've become a little bit skeptical here, where you see tech companies eliminating their ethics teams, where you have people like Sam Altman claiming that the sky is going to potentially fall with some of this AI and then charging ahead as fast as possible. We are seeing, I guess, some whistleblowers, some resistance by employees within some of these companies. And I think we might also want to distinguish between what we could call kind of common use companies like Google or Microsoft that are producing both products for the average consumer, products for commercial businesses, and then products for the military and intelligence communities on the one hand, and then companies that are producing only basically defense products. Because I think we as consumers have much more influence over the former, the common use companies versus the defense contractors. And we see outcries when some of these common use companies produce products that are pretty dumb, right? Google's large language model in the past couple of weeks is an example. So I guess I'm not sure how the sort of taking responsibility questions will play out. I know some on Lawfare have thought through some of the kind of tort options here, including strict liability ideas, and that seems worth at least thinking hard about.
And moving a bit into specific regulatory efforts, I think everyone is aware of the fact that we are in a bit of a Wild West, and hearing more about the sort of crises going on internally at OpenAI, and then examples, as you pointed out, Ashley, of AI not operating at all as intended or as we may expect it to work. We've seen state regulators, in particular in the US, begin to respond to the regulatory challenges presented by AI. Colorado, for example, passed an AI Act. California may soon follow in its wake. Specifically, California is considering a bill that would create a public AI research resource and a state entity to oversee the development of advanced AI models. Ashley, to start with you on this specific regulatory effort, are you Thinking that this is a good evolution, seeing states get into the fore, or might this be privacy regulation 2.0, where we see a patchwork of laws develop that kind of undermine a broader, more comprehensive federal effort?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm interested in the California AI safety bill. This is SB 1047, particularly because a lot of these companies are based in California. And so it has a prospect of having a really significant effect on how the companies act. And interestingly, it's really thinking about national security issues, right, which we don't always see states thinking about, and sometimes we don't even really want states thinking about. But it seems like the bill is really trying to limit the national security risks potentially posed by large language models, and kind of governing the ability to militarize these models or develop chemical or biological weapon systems with these models. And I guess I think that it's pretty positive as a development. I think it seems like a pretty thoughtful bill. I'm sure that the tech companies aren't in love with it, but it's also, kind of a laboratory of democracy idea where we'll see if it's effective, right? And Congress is thinking about these, the federal Congress thinking about these issues and trying to sort out what it should do. The Senate working group had a whole spate of ideas of possible regulation to think about in the future. And so seeing how the substance of the California bill and the kind of processes set up by the safety bill would work could be helpful to Congress. And, under the supremacy clause, if Congress comes in and decides to preempt that law, it can.
So we may see this sort of Sacramento effect in the U.S. context. Mark, obviously, headlines have been written ad nauseum about a Brussels effect with respect to regulating AI. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the EU is doing in this context and any kind of analog efforts to police the use of AI in a military context?
Well, in the EU AI Act has just passed. It's not in force yet, and it uses various techniques. But one technique is that it kind of identifies certain AI applications as particularly harmful or containing high risk, which are either prohibited or subject to heavier regulation. And I think from a US perspective, you need to kind of watch out for the EU regulation. As we can see with GDPR, where EU regulated personal data, it didn't only have consequences for EU companies, but also for US companies, because they want to provide their services on a global level. And if you're going to market the same service in Europe and US, the market where you have regulation first will set the standard. And there might be such a risk for the US when the EU is in front now with regulation, that it will also have an impact on US companies and the services they want to provide. So I think I don't know the details of the legislation in California, but from a European perspective, I think it would be odd if you would regulate this on a state level and not the federal level. And then at the federal level, you have to consider what's happening in Brussels.
So let's actually go back to the domestic context for a second, because Ashley, you were talking about federal legislation, and we haven't seen the sort of comprehensive legislation that would preempt something like the California law. But we have seen some AI things happen at the federal level. So obviously we've had this much vaunted, much criticized Senate AI roadmap that's come out. There's been some stuff, actually, not major stuff, but some stuff in the recent NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, addressing AI and national security. So I'd love to hear from you what you think about these federal interventions at this point.
Yeah, there, as you say, there have been a range of efforts. I think there have been few actual sort of bills or legislative text that's been passed, but clearly an increased attention to and understanding by members of Congress on these issues. There is, of course, kind of hanging over all this a tension between, on the one hand, concerns about safety, concerns about what our adversaries are doing, and a real commitment to keeping the United States in front. And you can imagine what some of the tensions are between safety on the one hand and accelerating development on the other. I'll mention just a couple. So the first is we have seen a couple of times proposals to prohibit the use of autonomy in nuclear launch. We saw it previously. I think it's now back in the House version of the 2025 NDAA, basically requiring that a human stay in the loop for nuclear launches. And Matt Waxman and I wrote a Lawfare post about a year ago on this, noting that it could raise some constitutional questions if you're trying to limit how the president could repel attacks using weapons that he already has in his arsenal. The executive has a policy that is consistent with these kinds of proposals. And apparently the UK and France also have committed to ensure that a human stays in the loop for nuclear launches. But of course, a future president could change that executive policy. So I think this might be one where Congress does successfully get this into legislation. There's also something called, it's a kind of bad pun, the 5 AIs Act.
Wow, that is a bad pun.
Riffing off, of course, the 5 Eyes, which are the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. I think there's a proposal in the Senate by Senator Rosen. I've looked at the House side bill, which was proposed a while back, using the same punny title. And the idea is to basically direct the Secretary of Defense to establish a working group on AI with the other 5 Eyes members. I think the idea is that they would compare, test, evaluate their AI systems in tandem, help accelerate interoperability, and here focus on how the systems might actually operate together and potentially kind of melt down if they were to engage with each other. That goes back to what we were talking about before, this concern about models confronting each other. I don't really know the extent to which the Pentagon and the IC are already engaging with the 5 Eyes on this, but I imagine they are. So I'm not quite sure why Congress thinks it needs to legislate in this space, but I do think it's potentially driven by concerns about things going on in New Zealand and Australia's neighborhood, i.e. China. Representative Sarah Jacobs has a proposal in the upcoming NDAA where it would basically ask the Pentagon or require the Pentagon to report to Congress on approvals that have happened under DoD's autonomy policy and also disapprovals that have happened under that policy and waivers, whether waivers have occurred there. And then as you mentioned, Alan, the kind of Senate AI working group creating the roadmap, kind of drawing in a whole bunch of experts to come and talk before the Senate. And I'd say the result seems a little bit scattershot. The national security section, I think, is first and foremost about talent acquisition and retention, not so much about ethics or should we encourage more weapons autonomy or not, wanting to make sure that we're monitoring adversaries' progress on artificial general intelligence. Yes, I hope we are doing that, worrying about adversary development of advanced bioweapons and so on. So, the summary of the forum on national security that came together to help inform the working group was really all about how the U.S. has to stay in the lead on this. So, I think the working group does have the product has some good ideas, and they may be things that we see in future bills, but I don't think there's going to be a sort of big sweeping solution to all of the challenges we've already talked about.
So looking back at a higher level about the extent to which AI is introducing anything new or markedly changing what we need from international humanitarian law, we've seen new technologies and new weapons develop for decades, and international humanitarian law has, for the most part, persisted and applied to the development of those new weapons. Mark, to what extent are we trying to reinvent the wheel? Do you think that existing IHL provisions are adequate, or are we in need of some sort of new framework specifically addressing the weaponization of AI?
I think to a large extent we can rely on existing rules and principles. I'm thinking about principle of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. All of these are relevant and should be held should be applicable to all new systems and applications. Now, I've suggested that maybe there's a need for some special regulations, but I think it's unrealistic to believe that there will be a comprehensive regulation of AI. I think only in certain situations. So I've been looking at the 1980 regulation on conventional weapons, and there's some protocols that were adopted at the same time, and one of them related to incendiary weapons. And I think one could strive to have a similar regulation on AI. And what I'm thinking of in particular is to avoid using AIs in populated areas. There is such a restriction for incendiary weapons, and I believe it could be realistic to reach an agreement on that, not to use AI-driven weapons applications or systems in populated areas.
And Ashley, you've written extensively on this topic. Similarly, do you have anything else to build on?
I agree with Mark that it seems very unlikely that we will be able to achieve a multilateral ban to which major military powers accede or adhere. I think Mark's proposal is really interesting, actually. I'm familiar with the Incendiaries Convention, but I had not focused on the prohibition against use in populated areas, which basically takes the principle of distinction and proportionality and kind of makes it easier to apply those rules, because you wouldn't be using that weapon in a case in which there would be such a threat of harming civilians. So that's a nice idea. And I think one that has come up in conversations already about regulating lethal autonomous weapons, using them either in a kind of purely defensive posture where they're static, or using them in constrained geographic areas where everything in that area is a military objective. So it's kind of the inverse of what Mark has just described. But it's a nice idea. I mean, there are a number of rules in IHL where it is not entirely clear how you apply them when you are using autonomous weapon systems. And I do think that the basic rules, things like distinction, proportionality, and precautions, get us a long way in making sure that lethal autonomous weapon systems are not abused. But there are interpretive complications, just as there are when you're thinking about how to apply the laws of armed conflict to cyber operations.
So in particular, building off of Mark's earlier reference to a sort of Uber idea of AI, where all of a sudden we're seeing these apps almost being used to undercut the intervention of humans in the loop, might we reach a point with the development of AI where the sort of subjective requirements that are necessary to make a finding of proportionality become much harder? In other words, if we make these systems so autonomous and so objectively based, are we going to see the idea of proportionality run out or become harder to apply with the sort of interpretive challenge you were referencing, Ashley? And we can start with Mark on this one.
Well, I think we can already see it to some extent now. I mean, there's this demand for increasing speed in warfare all the time. And I think it was Alan who asked initially, what are the risks? And I think there's been media reporting on Israel where they've acquired targets through one of these systems, where they've used it previously, already before this war between Israel and Hamas, to find Hamas leaders on a senior level. So they used AI to among all the information noise, to find these persons and later apply lethal force. What's happened during the present conflict is that they've used the same system to find targets, Hamas operatives on a medium, mid-level, or at simple Hamas fighters without any seniority within the organization. And they've done that to acquire larger amounts of targets. And that has had the result that the number of civilians or collateral damage has increased. And that's the danger, where you rely on these AI systems and you're supposed to evaluate the information before you take action. And that, according to media reporting, hasn't happened, where you rely on the AI system without the human taking any making any independent evaluation. So I think that's a danger, something that we're potentially seeing already now.
So just one point on that last comment that you made, Mark. I mean, I think it seems right that the individuals who were basically tasked with approving the targets, if reporting is correct, and I don't know whether it is, that they were not taking the time to go back and look at the information that led the system to recommend a particular target. But it also sounded as though there had been kind of pre-authorization to accept a certain level of civilian casualty in any event. And that's actually nothing to do with AI, right? That's just a decision by the military to set a particular level kind of for the kind of military advantage perceived to be gained. But going back to Kevin's question about proportionality in particular, I mean, I think that this is a place where making sure that your system can act consistent with proportionality is very tricky to kind of envision, because you basically need to be updating your system to reflect both estimated civilian harm and also estimated military advantage, which can change over time, including like in a day, it might change. And if you have launched a system and it's gone outside of it's stopped its connection with you, right? It's gone off to do its thing. The calculation, the proportionality calculation back at headquarters may actually have changed, even if the proportionality calculation in the traveling system hasn't changed. And I think this goes back to why Mark's proposal is a nice one, because if you don't have civilians potentially at risk, then you don't have to do a proportionality analysis. And so I think that's maybe a good example of where the translation exercise can be tricky.
So I want to turn back to this question of working with allies. We already talked about the 5 AIs Act, which I have to say is a hard thing to say. Just try to say that 5 times fast. Mark, let me ask you, do you think it's fair to say that the Act appears to be leaning into the militarization of AI by facilitating more coordination and use of it? And if so, do you think that things like the 5 AIs Act, would facilitate an arms race between allies and adversaries on AI issues?
Well, as long as it's with the kind of close allies of the US, I would imagine that it could be part of an arms race. I'm thinking vis-a-vis China. So in that sense, yes. And I mean, Europe is kind of on the side of everything. Nobody's really caring about Europe, but I think this is mainly, as I see it, a race between China and the US. And this 5 AI Act is, as I see it, clearly pointed towards China. So in that sense, it may encourage an arms race, yes.
Ashley, any commentary on the ongoing horse race?
Only that I would see legislation like the 5 AIs Act, Alan.
We really got to get what are the Senate interns doing this entire summer, if not coming up with better names?
Maybe it's a kind of, if you say it with an Australian accent, it sounds catchier or something.
If you'd like to try, Ashley.
You go
The
ahead.
5 AIs Act.
That's pretty good.
I'm not sure that whether the bill passes or not will really have that much of an effect on the kind of the future or the current arms race between the US and China. I mean, I think it could be a way for Congress to decide to appropriate some money to help advance this cooperation, but I'm not sure the Pentagon needs legislation to do that. I haven't dived into the appropriations question on that, but I mean, they may already be doing this. I know the U.S. is in conversations with its NATO allies about use of AI in collective self-defense and how to put some details on the kinds of sort of understanding that they already have developed about principles of responsible use for AI, sort of helping the rubber hit the road on what that actually means. We haven't mentioned AUKUS, but one of the pillars of AUKUS, the US, UK, Australia sort of collective, one of the pillars is related to AI. So I don't know that the 5 AIs Act is kind of a game changer. I think it's of a piece with a perception clearly by Congress. And I think also within actors like the National Security Commission on AI that the U.S. really needs to be in front on this.
And so returning back to that AI roadmap, I think it's telling that national security, I believe, was 8th of 9 topics. So it was already at the bottom. And so when we're thinking about actually having this issue prioritized, Ashley, in your forthcoming book, The Double Black Box, National Security, Artificial Intelligence, and the Struggle for Democratic Accountability, you argue that, quote, foreign allies are perhaps the group best positioned to urge the U.S. government to act lawfully, effectively, and with justification, end quote. Can you explain that a little bit further? Why might our allies actually help this become a priority for Congress and the U.S. government writ large?
Well, part of the thing I'm trying to do in the book is think about which actors beyond the traditional overseers of the executive can help make sure that the executive is acting consistent with our public law values. So things like legality, effectiveness, accountability, and the need to justify what we're doing. And while we can see pieces of the iceberg above the water, and we've talked about some of those pieces today, there's undoubtedly a lot going on under the surface of the water. Why? Because it's classified, right? And so I think foreign allies are actually one of the most important kind of non-traditional checks on the executive. We've seen it in the 2003 Iraq War. We saw ways in which, for example, the UK affected how we conducted detentions. We see it when states decide that they are not going to permit us to overfly their territory or in their airspace for certain reasons because they think that what we're doing is unlawful or inappropriate. So they really can, I think, serve as checks. And so there are a number of existing fora, many of which we've already talked about, where they can say to the U.S., look, this is your interpretation of proportionality when you're using AI. We're not sure we really agree with that. Let's talk about that some. Or, yeah, we thought about developing a system like that, but we ultimately got concerned that X and Y. Or, basically allow the U.S. to explain and justify what it's doing and maybe persuade them that we have the right approach. But I think they're a useful kind of non-traditional check that can make sure that we're going in the right place. And ultimately, if some of these tools become public, that we will have support, not just in the US, but also in countries like Mark's when it comes known.
So Mark, if we have this AI arms race on the one hand and an AI wrestling match for responsible AI on the other hand, anything to add there?
Well, if I may connect to what Ashley just said, I mean, to regulate AI, in a kind of non-national security setting is already very difficult. So I think it's very difficult, even more difficult, to regulate AI in a national security setting. I don't think we'll see statutory legislation in that part, and that's why I find what Ashley is saying is very persuasive. That there will be kind of more non-traditional checks and balances. I mean, a kind of conversation between allies. I agree with that. That may prove more realistic and important.
Well, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Mark and Ashley, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Pacha, and your audio engineer this episode was Noam Osband of Go Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.